It was a freezing night in late January, and the wind howled through the skeletal streets of a small industrial town. The kind of town where even the streetlights seemed reluctant to stay lit. James Callahan, a former engineer turned reluctant night watchman, trudged through the snow toward the shuttered warehouse he had been assigned to. He had taken the job out of necessity, though the building's skeletal frame and hollow corridors made him question the wisdom of it every step of the way. The night was silent except for the crunch of his boots and the occasional clatter of loose metal. Yet James felt certain he was being watched. Inside the warehouse, the temperature dropped even further, the cold penetrating the thick layers of his coat. The building smelled of rust, old paint, and something else he could not name, something like the lingering ghost of human presence. James switched on the flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the empty crates and steel beams. He should have felt relief at being inside, but the emptiness made him uneasy. Something in the air was off, like a pause between heartbeats, the calm before a storm. He walked past the rows of stacked crates, each one marked with faded stencils he could barely make out. As he reached the far end of the warehouse, a shadow moved against the wall, a shadow that did not match his own. James froze, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly as he followed the movement. Nothing, just the shadow, elongated and twisted by the angle of the light. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the dim light on the uneven floor. But then the shadow moved again, slower this time, almost deliberate, as if it were watching him. James swallowed hard and spoke, his voice echoing oddly in the cavernous space. "Hello?" No response. The shadow stretched and recoiled as though it were alive, but the temperature around him seemed to dip even further, making his breath fog in the beam of the flashlight. His heart raced. He tried to rationalize it. Rats, a loose tarp, the wind sneaking through broken windows. But his gut told him it was something else entirely. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. He could not tell. Time seemed fractured in that warehouse. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of steel, the whistle of the wind, even his own heartbeat. And then came the whispers, low, almost imperceptible, curling around him in the corners of his ears. James froze, straining to catch the words. There was no one there, and yet the whispering grew clearer, shaping itself into phrases that made no sense, yet were unmistakably human. "You should not be here, James." The voice, soft and intimate, made him jump. His flashlight flickered, then steadied, revealing nothing but empty crates and dust motes floating in the beam. The shadow on the far wall had not moved. He told himself he was imagining it, that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on his mind. But the cold had grown so sharp, so absolute, that it felt like it was pressing in from all sides, forcing him to acknowledge something he could not see, but knew was there. By midnight, James was exhausted, his rational mind battling a growing fear he could not name. The whispering had become constant now, murmuring his name, his thoughts, his deepest fears. He stumbled backward, tripping over a loose plank, and hit the floor hard. Pain radiated through his shoulder, but it was nothing compared to the terror rising in his chest. The shadow stretched and bent along the wall, mimicking his movements, yet it moved independently, deliberately, as if it were alive and aware. The next day, he tried to tell his supervisor what had happened, but the words would not come out right. I do not know. Something was there, he stammered. The older man, a grizzled veteran of decades of night shifts, nodded slowly, eyes hard and unreadable. Better keep your mind on the job, son. Warehouses are not safe, but we survive. You'll get used to the shadows. James sat alone in the warehouse, the dim winter light filtering through broken windows, casting fragmented beams on the concrete floor. The shadow was always there, coiled in the corners of his vision, waiting, observing. For months he had negotiated, tested, and learned its rhythms. He understood it now, not fully, but enough to anticipate its movements, to respond without panic. Yet he knew the final test was approaching. It began subtly at first. Objects would shift slightly, just enough to make him question his memory. Footsteps echoed where no one had walked. The whispers returned, more insistent, more articulate than ever. "You are ready," it said, and James felt a cold thrill run through him. He was ready, but ready for what? He did not yet know. That night, he set up a perimeter in the center of the warehouse. Candles lined the walls, their flames small but defiant, forming a protective circle. He sat in the middle, knees drawn, eyes closed. The shadow stretched across the walls, coalescing into vaguely human shapes, its whispers filling every corner of his consciousness. James spoke aloud, steady and deliberate. "I will face you. I will see you. I will understand." The shadow seemed to pulse, responding to his words, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. It spoke in voices he recognized, his own, Daniel's, even a distorted version of his mother's. But each phrase carried subtle threats, urging him to despair, to flee, to surrender. "You cannot win," it hissed. "You are mine." James opened his eyes. The shapes on the walls solidified, forming a tall, thin figure, almost humanoid, but with edges that seemed to ripple unnaturally. Its presence was suffocating, pressing against his chest, yet he did not move. He had trained himself not to flee. He spoke again, louder this time. "You are a part of me, not the other way around. I am not afraid." The shadow recoiled slightly, as if surprised by his defiance. Its whispers became chaotic, overlapping and jumbled, like multiple radios tuned to different frequencies at once. James felt the air vibrate with tension, the warehouse itself seeming to hold its breath. He realized then that the shadow thrived on uncertainty, on hesitation. Courage was its weakness. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had long since lost meaning. James recited truths aloud, mistakes he had made, regrets he had hidden, fears he had buried. Each confession seemed to drain the shadow, diminishing its power, fragmenting its shape. It writhed across the walls, sometimes splitting into multiple forms, sometimes flattening into indistinct darkness. Then came the first contact. A cold pressure on his shoulder, but unlike before, it did not burn or sting. It felt like recognition, acknowledgement, a silent agreement. James leaned into it, speaking directly to the presence. "I see you. I know you. I accept you. But you do not control me." The warehouse went silent. The wind outside ceased. The faint hum of the city disappeared. And in that silence, James felt clarity for the first time in months. The shadow was not an invader. It was a reflection, amplified by his isolation and fear, but ultimately a part of him that had demanded recognition. By confronting it, he had acknowledged his own mind, his own vulnerabilities, without being consumed. Then, something unexpected happened. The shape of the shadow began to shift, forming a human silhouette, distinct and familiar. It looked like Daniel, smiling faintly. James felt a shock of unease, but also understanding. The shadow had learned, adapted, mirrored his own interactions with others. Its intelligence was not separate from him. It was a synthesis of observation, memory, and fear. "You have changed," the figure whispered. Its voice was almost warm, almost human. "But change comes with cost." James nodded. "I know. I accept it." For a long moment, the warehouse was still. The shadow seemed to shrink, retreating into corners, flattening, dispersing into faint flickers of darkness. James stood, testing the space around him. The whispers had faded, but a faint presence lingered, subtle but undeniable. He could live with it. He could coexist. Relieved but exhausted, James began documenting everything he had learned. The warehouse, once a place of terror, became a laboratory for understanding fear and perception. He wrote about the shadow, about its patterns, about how acknowledgement and confrontation could diminish its power. Yet even as he wrote, he knew it would never truly disappear. It was part of him now, inseparable from his consciousness. Days turned into weeks. James ventured outside, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. He reconnected with friends, though he kept the warehouse and its secret to himself. The shadow was always with him, a quiet companion in the periphery of perception, reminding him of the fragility of reality and the strength required to confront it. Then, one evening, as he returned to the warehouse to check his notes, he found the space altered. Objects had shifted again, but not randomly. They formed a pattern, almost like a message. His heart pounded as he deciphered it. Letters scratched into the floor, spelling words he could not have written. "You are ready to see the others." James froze. He had not expected this. The shadow had prepared him, trained him, and now it was opening a door he did not know existed. He felt fear, exhilaration, and awe simultaneously. The warehouse was no longer just a laboratory. It was a gateway to something larger, something beyond his understanding. He stepped into the center of the pattern. The shadow shifted around him, coalescing into a human form again, this time taller, darker, more imposing. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the dim light. "They are waiting," it said, "and you will join them, or you will remain alone forever." James felt a surge of adrenaline. He realized the final test was not just about confronting fear, it was about connection, about understanding that the shadow was a bridge to a reality he had not yet seen. His mind raced, weighing risk against knowledge. Could he cross the threshold, step into the unknown, and survive? Or would he remain trapped in his own perceptions, a prisoner of the warehouse and his fear? He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The shadow followed, enveloping him, guiding him, merging with him. The warehouse dissolved around him, replaced by a space that was at once familiar and alien. Figures emerged from the darkness, not fully human, not fully shadow, yet each mirrored a part of James he had confronted over the months. Fear, regret, courage, curiosity, and obsession. They circled him, silent, observing, waiting for his reaction.
James understood at last. The shadow had been a teacher, a test, and a gatekeeper. These others were the culmination, the beings formed from all who had faced their own shadows, those who had survived the psychological labyrinth of fear and recognition. They did not speak, but radiated presence, demanding acknowledgement. He took another deep breath. "I see you. I understand," he said. And for the first time, he felt truly fearless.
The figures responded, a subtle ripple of acknowledgement passing through them. The shadow, now merged fully with him, whispered one last time, "You are not alone. You never were." And then the warehouse returned. The candles flickered, the wind howled outside, and the city hum resumed. James was alone, or so it appeared, but he knew better. The shadow, and the others, lingered just at the edge of perception, a permanent echo of his journey. He smiled, a mixture of relief, fear, and awe. He had faced the darkness and emerged not just unbroken, but transformed. He walked out of the warehouse that night, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and felt a presence following, not threatening, not controlling, but companionable, guiding. He knew he had crossed a threshold that few could ever comprehend. And in that quiet realization, he understood the most terrifying and exhilarating truth. The shadow would always be with him, but it no longer controlled him. James Callahan had survived the labyrinth of his own mind, and in surviving, he had glimpsed something beyond fear, beyond understanding, a reality shaped by perception, courage, and the shadows we carry within ourselves. James did not feel reassured. He left work early, his mind replaying the night like a film stuck on the same terrifying frame. He began noticing shadows everywhere, at home, on the street, in reflections in the store windows. It was not just the warehouse. Something about him had changed, or maybe it had always been there, and the whispers had followed him, soft and persistent, crawling into his thoughts when he least expected them. As the weeks passed, James became obsessed. He returned to the warehouse night after night, hoping to confront whatever was haunting him. Each visit was worse than the last. The shadow grew more distinct, more intentional, moving even when no light was cast. The whispers became intelligible, filling his mind with phrases meant to manipulate him. "You are nothing without me. You cannot leave. We see your thoughts before you do." Sleep became impossible. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint whispers that had followed him home. His friends noticed the change, the way his eyes darted around the room, the jittery motions of his hands, the trembling when he spoke. But when he tried to explain, the words failed him. How could he explain a shadow that spoke, a presence that seemed to know every corner of his mind? It was not just the fear of the shadow that consumed him. It was the realization that he could not trust his own memory, his own perception. Things happened, and then he doubted they had happened. Conversations with friends blurred into imagined dialogues. Footsteps in his apartment seemed to belong to strangers, but when he checked, no one was there. And always, always the shadow, waiting, observing, speaking. One night, desperate for answers, he brought a notebook and a recorder to the warehouse. He spoke aloud, narrating his fear, trying to make sense of it. "I do not know who you are, what you want, but I am not afraid," he said. The shadow shifted, more defined now, almost human in form. The whispers became laughter, soft, dry, mocking. The recorder, when he played it back, was silent. The notebook contained only lines he had not written, phrases and commands he could not have imagined. "Follow the rules, James, or you cease to exist." The obsession escalated. James began skipping work, avoiding friends, barely eating. He spent every night at the warehouse, documenting, speaking, confronting. And then came the first touch, a brush against his shoulder. So light he almost dismissed it as a gust of wind, but it left a burn, a lingering heat that spread like poison. Panic gripped him. He tried to flee, but the doors locked themselves. The warehouse became a prison, and the shadow a warden. By mid-February, James had lost all sense of normalcy. He lived in the warehouse, a shell of the man he had once been. Days and nights blurred. He spoke only to the shadow, begging it, bargaining, sometimes screaming in frustration. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to understand it. The shadow was not just an external force. It was a mirror of his own mind, amplified and distorted by the isolation and fear he had endured. It knew him better than he knew himself, exposing insecurities, lies he had told others, moments of cowardice and regret. The breakthrough, or perhaps the collapse, came on a night when the wind was so fierce it rattled the windows like skeletal fingers. The shadow moved close, almost enveloping him. And James realized he was no longer speaking to it. He was speaking to himself, or at least to the part of himself he had buried deep, the part that feared and hated and wished to be free. "You cannot escape," the shadow whispered. "Not now, not ever." James swallowed hard. "Then I'll change the rules," he said, voice shaking. "I will not be controlled." The shadow paused. The air grew heavier. For the first time, James felt a sliver of empowerment. He would not run. He would not submit. And yet, the cost of this realization was clear. He was no longer alone in his mind. Whatever had haunted him had become part of him, inseparable, a cohabitant in the deepest corners of his consciousness. And so began the final stage, though James did not yet know it. The warehouse, once empty and silent, was alive with echoes, echoes of fear, echoes of defiance, echoes of the man he was becoming. The shadow would always be there, but now it was a test, a companion, a reminder of what he had survived and what he must face. James understood that survival was not about defeating the shadow. It was about understanding it, negotiating with it, and, perhaps, embracing it. The days blurred into weeks after that night. James no longer marked time with calendars or clocks. He marked it with the shadow. Its presence was constant, a coiled tension in every corner of his consciousness. Even when he stepped outside the warehouse for the briefest moments, he felt its gaze following him, stretching across the streetlights, slipping through cracked doors, whispering just beneath the hum of the city. Friends and coworkers began avoiding him. Conversations felt dangerous. He could no longer trust that the words he spoke were not twisted by the shadow before they left his lips. One evening, he decided he needed to confront it directly, to understand what it wanted. He set up a small circle of lights in the center of the warehouse, candles trembling on the concrete floor, though their flames barely illuminated the enormous space. He sat in the middle, knees drawn to his chest, and spoke aloud, his voice echoing off the steel beams. "Show me what you are. I need to know who you are," he demanded, trying to keep fear from cracking his voice. The shadow shifted, stretching across the walls, coalescing into vague shapes that suggested a human form, yet always incomplete. It mimicked him, copying gestures and postures with eerie precision. Its whispers began again, soft and overlapping, sometimes speaking in the cadence of his own voice. "You cannot know me, James," it said finally, in a tone that sounded both his and not his. "I am your fear, your doubt, your regret, your truth." James shivered, realizing that everything he had feared, the hallucinations, the whispers, the sense of being watched, was not entirely external. The shadow was a reflection, magnified by isolation and obsession. The weeks of sleep deprivation and anxiety had opened a door in his mind, and the shadow had stepped through. But understanding did not bring relief. If anything, it intensified his terror. He began to notice subtle manipulations in his environment. Objects slightly moved. Doors left ajar when he was certain he had closed them. Faint marks on the walls he did not recall making. And the shadow grew more confident, speaking in clearer sentences, sometimes even forming words on the floor in frost or dust. "You are not ready," it said one night, letters sprawling across a metal crate. "You will never escape what you are." James began to experiment, testing the boundaries. He would speak thoughts aloud that he feared, watch the shadow respond, record its movements on his camera. But no camera could capture it. No recording could hold the whispers. Even when he wrote descriptions, the words on paper changed, rearranging into new messages he had never written. His grip on reality frayed further, yet he could not stop. There was a compulsion, a need to map the shadow, understand its rules, and perhaps bend them. He began to lose track of days entirely. He no longer knew what was real and what was projection. Friends tried to intervene, bringing meals and urging him to rest. He refused them, insisting they could not help, that they would never understand. Even the police had been called once, when a neighbor reported screams, but when officers arrived, the warehouse was silent. No sign of disturbance, no evidence of anyone else inside, except James, who looked exhausted and wild-eyed. One night, in the depths of this obsession, James found a small notebook tucked behind a beam he had never noticed before. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, and filled with writing in a handwriting that was his own, yet unfamiliar. Descriptions of events he did not remember experiencing, thoughts he did not think, fears he had never acknowledged. The shadow's whispers seemed to resonate with the words, almost as if the notebook was a map of its presence, a ledger of his mind's vulnerabilities. James realized he was not just haunted, he was catalogued. Every anxiety, every hesitation, every shameful memory had been noted and amplified, a psychological maze designed to trap him within his own thoughts. He felt both violated and illuminated. The shadow was not just a tormentor. It was a teacher of sorts, the cruel and unforgiving. Determined to regain control, James decided on a risky plan. He would confront the shadow in total darkness, removing every source of light, every reflection, leaving only himself and the warehouse. He believed that if he could face it without external references, he might isolate the entity and finally assert dominance. He stripped the space of candles, extinguished flashlights, and waited, sitting cross-legged in the center of the cavernous warehouse. The shadow responded immediately. Darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against him, whispering threats and truths. It taunted him with memories he had tried to bury, with moments of cowardice, dishonesty, and failure. Yet James forced himself to stay, to breathe, to acknowledge it without flinching. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. He no longer knew, which was exactly the point. The shadow thrived in the liminal space where perception fractured. "You think you can fight me?" it hissed, voice layered and echoing from every angle. "You are nothing without me." "I am everything with me," James said, surprisingly steady. "And you are a part of me, nothing more." The air seemed to shiver at his words. The shadow paused, a ripple passing through its form as if testing his conviction. For the first time, it felt uncertain. James leaned into that uncertainty, speaking aloud all the truths he had denied, all the fears he had ignored. He let the shadow witness him fully, without shame or concealment. Something shifted. The whispers slowed, and the air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted slightly. James felt clarity, a fragile but undeniable sense that he had established a boundary. He was not conquered. He was aware, and awareness was a kind of freedom. But freedom came with cost. The shadow did not vanish. It remained, an indelible mark on his consciousness. It had integrated itself, becoming a companion he could neither ignore nor banish. It whispered less, but the knowledge of its presence changed him. It sharpened him. He began to understand patterns in its movements, in the manipulation of his environment. He learned to predict its interjections, and to recognize when a thought was his and when it was amplified by the shadow. Weeks turned into months. James began venturing out of the warehouse again, though he always returned before nightfall. He could not let the world see his unraveling. The shadow might follow, but only he would know. He began documenting his experiences, careful now to distinguish between what was external and what was internal, what was objective and what was reflection. The warehouse, once a prison, became a laboratory for understanding his own mind, and the shadow became a teacher and a challenge, a mirror that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. And then came the unexpected arrival of someone else, a new night watchman, sent to replace him temporarily. The man's name was Daniel. Young, eager, and oblivious to the warehouse's strange nature, he entered without fear, joking about ghosts and shadows. James watched from the darkness, curious to see how the shadow would respond to an intruder. It did not respond immediately. The shadow waited, observing Daniel, noting his reactions, whispering subtly, unseen. Daniel moved confidently, making small talk, laughing at imagined horrors. James realized something terrifying. The shadow was not just bound to him. It could observe, manipulate, and perhaps even influence others who entered the warehouse. The realization made him shiver. He had thought he had containment, but the entity's reach was broader than he had imagined. Daniel left after a short shift, unaware of anything abnormal, and James returned to his center, feeling the weight of what he had learned. The shadow remained, and now it carried new potential, a capacity to expand its influence. The stakes had changed. He was no longer merely surviving. He was guarding a secret, managing a force he could never fully control. James understood something crucial in that moment. Knowledge and awareness were not enough. The shadow required constant vigilance, constant negotiation, and above all, humility. He could master fear, but he could never master the shadow entirely. And that was its power.